Welcome to this special episode of Diabetes Bio. I'm Kevin Williams, and today we have a two-part Sweet Talk segment. First up, we will be talking with Drs. Christopher Newgard from Duke University and Dr. Lou Philipson from the University of Chicago. They are co-chairs on the ADA Pathways Mentor Advisory Group, or MAG, and they will be filling us in on what this program's all about and what's on the horizon. Then in part two, we catch up with Dr. Céline Riera from Cedars-Sinai in LA. Dr. Riera is a recipient of the Pathways Initiator Award and kicks off our article series with a piece she wrote for the March 2024 edition of the journal titled Wiring the Brain for Wellness, Sensory Integration in Feeding and Thermogenesis. So let's get started. Welcome to part one of Sweet Talk. Today we welcome Drs. Christopher Newgard from Duke University Medical Center and Dr. Louis Philipson from the University of Chicago School of Medicine. As co-chairs of the American Diabetes Association Pathway to Stop Diabetes Mentor Advisory Group, they're here to discuss the history and future of the Pathway to Stop Diabetes Award Initiative. Thank you both for joining us today.
Our pleasure.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I think our listeners are interested in the history of this initiative. I believe it's been about 10 years now since it was started. Dr. Newgard, maybe you can start us off, and then Dr. Philipson can join in. Perhaps discuss a little bit about the origins and the development of this initiative. Were you both involved with this initiative from the beginning? Could you hit on a role for this initiative at the basic science level as well as clinically?
Thanks. It's been going since 2013, but the planning for it began earlier than that in 2012. I think some of the important players in bringing this about included Karen Talmadge, Al Powers, who was the chair of the scientific advisory group for the board at the time, Bob Ratner, who was the president of medical and science affairs of the ADA at the time. Ron Kahn was the first chair of the Mentor Advisory Group, and Will Cephalou came on and made important contributions early and then through the middle years. It was conceived to provide an alternate funding opportunity for people that we wanted to keep in diabetes research, the best and the brightest, and especially the younger investigators. Because around 2012, 2013, that was really some tough times, a nadir period in funding from the National Institutes of Health, with something on the order of 11 to 12% of grant applications getting funded from the NIH. And we were really concerned that postdocs coming out of their postdoctoral fellowship to start a faculty position, or those who had started faculty positions as assistant professors and had to renew their first grant, it was really, really tough sledding with a funding level of 11 to 12% at the NIH. So we wanted to try to be very proactive in keeping the best and brightest in diabetes research. And that was really an important genesis of the program. Lou, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, even now, there's a big gap in young faculty who are ready for senior positions, or even young faculty who are ready for any position. So to support them for that length of time, and as we'll get into in both basic and clinical research, was very important. And the idea that, it shouldn't just be people who were a slam dunk at NIH, NIDDK, and so on. It might be people who had an idea that might not quite work for DK funding, and also gave them a longer period of time. So it was an amazing idea at the time. I remember the great excitement when it was announced.
So yeah, I would add that Ron Kahn reached out along with Bob Ratner to recruit a very senior and accomplished team to join the Mentor Advisory Group, which the Mentor Advisory Group serves both to review the grant applications that come in for this award. But a unique feature of the way this was set up was that the Mentor Advisory Group, once awardees were chosen by merit, we were expected to interact, especially with the younger awardees, and to serve as mentors, both scientifically and in terms of introduction to quote unquote Diabetes Research Society, right? In our position as more veteran investigators. So I think it's really important to remember that when Ron and Bob Ratner reached out, we had a tremendous response. Just basically everybody who was asked to be on the mentor advisory group. And these are accomplished, very busy people. Everybody said yes. And we had a really, really strong group starting from 2013 and really up to this day of very accomplished, very knowledgeable veteran scientists. And one of the things that's happened in terms of evolution, and I'd like Lou to speak to this, is it was probably a little bit more skewed towards the basic mechanistic science members of the mentor advisory group in the early years. But over time, the ADA and members of our group have realized that we really want to make sure to have the clinical research component represented as well. And Lou can speak to that.
Yeah, I think my own career, reflects that sort of a transition in thinking. I mean, I think to have, two leaders, one who is basic science focused, and since I came out of my world with a PhD first, then I went to medical school and became a clinical diabetologist. I was never, even though I had all the certifications, I never really did general endocrinology for very long. We had this emphasis on understanding how to do more clinical research. So in those middle years, there was already several grants that went to clinical investigators. And I can remember several that, again, may not have had the forum at NIH funding to come together. And what this group was able to do was provide them with mentorship and also a kind of a warm hug that you are doing great work, and to come back and speak at the ADA meeting, that was a big deal, to have a separate forum to really promote their work. And it put them in a different level. So it was not just, here's money, go do your thing. It was, no, we're going to help you. We're going to watch you closely, and we're going to be there for you as things continue. So I think that really made this a very big effort that was different in kind from just being a funding agency.
That's perfect. To both of you, in the recent times, there's been the challenges of the pandemic. How have these influenced the Pathway Award and its recipients? And then beyond that, moving forward in both that basic science and clinical perspective, where do you see the award initiative headed? Are there any possible expansions of the number of awards, possibly categories to address new and emerging needs or research areas?
Yeah, we've been through a gauntlet, really. When the pandemic hit, that coincided with rough times for the entire American Diabetes Association in terms of its fundraising initiatives, and Pathways was not spared. So whereas in the earlier years we would get something on the order of 100 applications, and we're able to fund somewhere between 4 and 6 of those applications. By the time we got to the pandemic in 2020, we actually had to shut the program down for 2 years for lack of funding for Pathways specifically. But it was a remarkable time, because what we decided to do is to hold monthly seminars, led by the awardees, presenting their work, and with all the mentor advisory group members attending. And that was very well attended, with lots of participation, lots of questions, lots of connections. And we managed to make it through the valley, so to speak, of low funding to where today Pathways has come back. And this past year, we were able to fund 3 awards. So we're kind of proud of the resurrection of the program. And we're very, very hopeful that it will continue in that direction, because I'll say it again, the support for the young scientists that are transitioning from postdoc to first faculty, or from first faculty to first NIH grant renewal, those are very vulnerable times. And if we want to keep the best and the brightest connected to diabetes research, we got to keep funding that. And let me just say, as metrics of success of this program, in 2002, we had 34 funded researchers from 700 nominations. So this is a tough award to get. This is the creme de la creme. But among our young investigators in the initiator category, which are the ones that transition from postdoc to first faculty, 100% secured an independent faculty position within 2 years of receiving their award. So that really shows that the program is working to advance the young scientists in the way that we would like. So we've come out of a dry period, and we have a lot of hope and promise for re-expanding the program in the years to come.
Yeah, it's certainly, you know, Phoenix-like, basically, you know, rising from the ashes a little bit. But, you know, I was fortunate enough or not fortunate enough to be ADA president in 2019, which probably was the last year before, you know, everything changed in capital letters. And I remember in San Francisco, we had something like 5,000 people in one room. I mean, let alone 15 or more thousand people at the meeting. And the Pathways speakers had a terrific forum at that meeting. And then by 2020, of course, the following year, everything had changed. So to pivot to, you know, this sort of approach, you know, what actually how we're communicating today, you know, using various video platforms, I think save the effort in a large way for all of us. I mean, the entire field, in fact, I think all of science and in many industries, everyone was able to learn how to pivot and learn how to communicate this way. And so today, Pathways, just like everything else, is done pretty much remotely. So the meetings, the review of the applications, all of it is learnings from those very difficult years. And yet we're also celebrating the in-person talks this year at the ADA. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But it was hard. And one of the things I want to really say for a moment, and maybe Chris will also speak to this, is the nature of the funders. I mean, some of the funders who basically said, what can I do during COVID? And the emphasis really changed for so many nonprofits, not only diabetes. It was a tough time, how to actually keep, you know, any sort of activity going, how to keep funding going. So I think the resurgence speaks a great deal to the perseverance of the people in the diabetes effort, the ADA in particular, and the people who are interested in donating. So I think we do want to recognize the folks who donate, the corporations who donate specifically for this program. So that's really something I think important to recognize.
Agreed. It's super important.
Yeah, I do love that mentorship aspect that the award provides, a community and network that's established to these awardees. I'm wondering if there's an effort to keep the awardees involved beyond the award timeline. I think there might be an effort to bring them into some kind of the mentorship aspect, and I wondered if you could share with us a part of that initiative.
So I hate to admit this, but we're aging out. You know, it was a veteran committee when it was conceived in 2013, and you know, time doesn't stop for us either. We really worked hard to recruit the best talent and applicant pool, and we feel like we've awarded the grants to a really outstanding and talented group of people. We definitely want some of them to come on to ensure the future of this program and come onto the mentor advisor group. And we're in the process of talking to ADA leadership about when and how to do that. But if we're going to keep this program going, we have to keep it vital. And that's a big part of how you do it.
Yeah, that's right. I think part of our job is to be sure the thing is self-renewing, and the only way to do that is to, you know, ensure that subsequent generations are on the group. Now, it may be that we have to skip a generation or two. So I think with sort of the dearth that's happened in training and joining faculties over the last 20 years, even absent the pandemic, it's been hard to fill positions. And likewise, it's been hard to fill mentorship, advisory, grant review committees. I mean, it's not easy. And people, the whole tempo of especially clinical research, although I think all research would fall into that, has changed. So there is more emphasis on wonderful things like having a life and being able to do things outside. Maybe we don't have committee meetings on Saturday morning so much anymore. So there's little things that reflect the changing, and to make sure that we get younger folks, earlier career people involved, and to make sure that their careers progress. And one way to do that is to put them on review committees and to be sure that they understand that part of their commitment and part of the responsibility in getting funding is to be part of the process going forward. So that's what really we're looking for, already starting. We've been talking about it now since I joined a couple of years ago. So I think it's time now to make it happen.
And as we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about the Pathway to Stop Diabetes Award Initiative? Is there any particular advice you may offer those interested in applying for this award initiative?
Yeah, I've had the great good fortune to have one of the young faculty in the unit I lead at Duke, the Duke Molecular Physiology Institute, having won one of these awards. And I can attest to the incredible impact that the award has had. This young man Philip White has built a very vigorous lab with postdocs and graduate students and technicians, publishing in top journals, getting NIH grants. I mean, he was an initiator awardee, so came out of postdoctoral fellowship with me and out into an independent faculty position. Incredibly impactful. And here, the advice I would have is this: the numerology is tough. The number of applications that come in versus the number that are awarded, that ratio is a tough ratio, but it's worth it. I would say to the young people, it's worth it because it creates a 5 to 7 year window of very significant funding where you can really get your team in place and prepare for success and contributions to better therapies for diabetes. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, and I'd like to say that the mission is large, and one gets the sense there's a feeling that the emphasis has always been on basic science, and so as I said before, I started my career in the lab, spent a lot of years changing white powders to other white powders. Also then my basic background was in cellular electrophysiology and calcium imaging, but always saw patients. And then something happened in my life where a patient, this was a mutual change of lives. So we changed her life, changed ours, and my direction changed completely maybe 17 years ago. So now my work is entirely translational. And it's hard because while the timeline in many basic science experiments can be long, at least sometimes you get the sense there's incremental stuff that will come out. And sometimes in clinical translational research, the timeline is so long that it doesn't lend itself to having major science Nature papers every year. It just doesn't work out that way. So this sort of funding is ideal for people with a longer timeline. I had a dean not too long ago who said a few times that the best model animal for our science is in fact the human. So while that's arguable, and there are different ways of looking at what models mean, people should know that this opportunity extends very strongly to people doing translational clinical research as well. And that the effort is clear and ongoing, that people who are interested in those areas not only get consideration, they get funded. And that, I think, should really stimulate people to think about crafting their voice, talking to people on the review committee, talking to me and Chris about, what sorts of things may be applicable, or even the F word, fundable. And we would love to hear from them, people who are maybe on the bubble, not sure. And I can totally endorse what Chris has said. It's worth doing.
Well, this is a really great conversation, enlightening on the Pathways Award Initiative. Thank you both to Dr. Newgard and Dr. Philipson for joining us today to discuss this initiative by the American Diabetes Association. For those of you interested in finding out more about the Pathways Award, you can go to diabetes.org/research/pathway. Welcome to part 2 of Sweet Talk. We're thrilled to welcome Dr. Céline Riera, an assistant professor from Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. Dr. Riera was the recipient of the Pathway to Stop Diabetes Initiator Award in 2015, which focused on identification of sensory neural circuits controlling metabolic disorders. Dr. Riera has contributed a thought-provoking perspective article based on her award-winning research, which is featured in the March 2024 edition of the journal. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Riera join us to further discuss this topic. Dr. Riera, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Kevin. It's my great pleasure to be here.
So let's get started with a little bit of an icebreaker question. I'm curious about your background prior to your scientific career. Could you share a little bit about what initially drew you to a career in science and studying metabolic diseases? Was there any particular experience or influence that guided you towards this path?
Yeah, so it's been a fun journey, but I think it started as a child. So I grew up in the French countryside, and where I grew up, there's a lot of mountains. It's near the Pyrenees Mountains. So it's a really beautiful area. It's very wild. And as a child, I always enjoyed with my family looking at plants, finding culinary plants, also finding, learning about medicinal plants. And I had a lot of people in my life at that stage, like teaching me about these plants and what nature was about. And I think it really brought a lot of curiosity in my life to understand biology. And I really fell in love with biology in college and decided this is what I wanted to study later on. So it guided me to a PhD where I started to learn about sensory perception. And there was a lot of serendipity because back in the day, I was in college in France, but then I followed my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, to Switzerland. And in Switzerland, Nestle Research was offering a pre-doctoral program. So that's how I got into my PhD program. And Nestle was very interested about sensory systems and now they function to detect taste and smell. So I decided to do my PhD on taste perception. Later on, I got interested in the communication between taste and nutrition and olfaction and nutrition. And throughout the years, it guided me to metabolic research.
That's great. I think that leads us right up to your Pathway Initiator Award. Possibly you could give our audience a bit of a background for what led to your Pathways application. What was the state of the field at the time of your application? Maybe what was the motivation for the scientific pursuit in that award application?
Yeah, so when I applied to the Pathway program, I think it was only the second year that the program existed. It was still pretty new at the time, and my application came from the work that I just wrapped up in a publication on aging biology. And in this publication, we were interested in understanding how mutation in a sensory receptor led to increased lifespan. And the conclusion was that this was a trip channel TRPV1 deletion. We found on the mice that had lost TRPV1 had an extended lifespan. They were protecting against age-onset disease in mice, which means that they didn't have as much cancer as the control mice. And one of the most interesting findings of this study was that these mice had a useful metabolism. So they were just doing better over time. They maintained their metabolism. Their metabolism looked more like young mice. And I really started to dig into that. And we found that the mice had improved insulin secretion upon glucose challenge. And they had increased beta cell mass proliferation. So when we just finished that study, we published it in Cell. The Pathway application, it was an obvious choice for me to try to get that. I was towards the end of my postdoc, and this looked like a great opportunity to apply. So back in the day, I think the field was still in its infancy in understanding the role of the nervous system in metabolism. There was still quite a bit of controversy that the nervous system played a role in regulating metabolism. And I think my application back in the day was really looking into that and was bringing perhaps a new perspective on the contribution of the nervous system in integrating environmental cues and shaping metabolic function in the organism.
That's really great. The study of the regulation of lifespan across species is really fascinating. It does seem like there could be a connection between how we manage our energy needs or wants and how long we might live. It might be more intertwined than many of us might actually have thought. Could you share a little bit more of your insights with that research leading up to the Pathways application? And I guess many of our listeners are going to be eager to hear any tips or findings that you might have to boost your lifespan.
Yes, this study that we had was really showing that if you have a useful metabolism, that extends longevity, at least in a mouse model. And looking back at previous studies that were looking at long-lived mice, there was quite a few already. There was a common trait that was starting to appear and that has been confirmed over the years, that basically any mouse model of increased lifespan has increased energy expenditure. That means that the metabolic rate is higher, the animals are burning more calories, either through more thermogenesis, which means that they're utilizing their adipose tissue to burn lipids and consume a lot of fuels and increase their metabolic rate. It really is a common trait in pretty much all the long-lived mouse models. I don't think there is a single one that doesn't have increased energy expenditure, whether it's a direct effect of whatever transgenic or mutation that people have been studying, or whether it's a consequence of that would be an indirect consequence. So pretty much every single mouse model has increased energy expenditure. And it's really interesting because, of course, it's nice to extend lifespan in a mouse, but we're all very interested in what happens in humans at the end of the day. And there is a lot of correlation in humans to show that energy expenditure is also a readout for extended lifespan. There's been quite a few studies that shows that, for example, older individuals, if they have a higher metabolic rate late in life, even if they start picking exercise in their 70s or later, that will have a beneficial effect on their lifespan and health span. And the quest is really, I think, health span more than lifespan, which means that we're interested in extending health, not necessarily the number of years that we live, but extending the healthy years of our lives. Again, in humans, people that run, people that exercise, there's been many studies that shows that having a higher metabolic rate, either because they have increased muscle mass or other phenotypes of increased metabolism, is associated with increased lifespan. So a healthy diet, a lot of exercise are definitely good for living a long, healthy life. Obviously, there are genetic components that we don't fully understand, but environmental factors that we can control are definitely diet and exercise.
That's a great distinction between lifespan and health span, something that definitely should be discussed more. As it relates to the outcomes of your Pathways Award, maybe you can discuss some of these major outcomes or accomplishments of the research during the Pathway Initiator Award, maybe touching on how it has advanced or is working towards advancing an understanding of metabolic disorders.
Yes, so when I got the Pathway Award, there was pretty much one key question that I wanted to ask, which was, what is the role of sensory systems in metabolism? And when I say sensory system, there are obviously quite a few things that come at play, but in my research, the idea was really to understand how we perceive the environment and how does that influence metabolism. So I focused on understanding two different modalities of sensory perception because there's too many to cover. And one of them has been to understand the role of olfaction in regulating metabolism. And the other one has been to understand the role of thermoregulation, perception of the environment, the temperature of the environment, and the regulation of metabolism. We had a series of papers over the years looking at olfaction. And one of the things that we found right when I got the Pathway Award was that if we were removing olfactory neurons in the nose of animals using genetic models, there was a metabolic shift in those animals, which was associated with increased beiging of their adipose tissue and increased browning of their brown adipose tissue. They had increased energy expenditure, they were resistant to diet-induced obesity, But we just didn't know how this was happening, because this was a very crude experiment where we removed some neurons, the animals cannot smell anymore, but we didn't know how this was achieved. So over the years, I've started to look at what happens in the brain, and with my team, we uncovered some neurons in the hypothalamus that seem to be integrating those olfactory inputs, and they have the capacity to increase energy expenditure, but also suppress feeding. So those neurons are found in the dorsomedial hypothalamus, and we collaborated with Dr. Yuki Oka at Caltech to generate a single cell atlas of this region, because it's very complex, as you know, the cellular heterogeneity of this hypothalamic region. So we need to get a better understanding of all the different types of neurons that are in there, and to start asking those questions. So we found that there was a population of neurons in the dorsomedial hypothalamus which express cholecystokinin, CCK, which appear to be important for energy metabolism by regulating feeding and energy expenditure. So we think those neurons are pretty important for olfaction. So this is for the olfactory research. For the temperature sensing, I have been following up on my postdoctoral fellow work, which identified those TRPV1 sensory neurons as important for lifespan and health span. And we just wanted to know how loss of some ion channel can sort of improve metabolic health and longevity. And in order to do that, we've been looking into different types of models. We ablated CGRP, which is calcitonin gene-related peptide, which is a neuropeptide that is secreted by those TRPV sensory neurons, which are nociceptive neurons, which are found in the dorsal ganglia. And when we removed the CGRP neurons, the mice were resistant to diet-induced obesity. They also had increased energy expenditure. They had a lot of phenotype that really looked like the TRPV1 knockout. But in particular, what we found is that when we removed the CGRP sensory neurons, the mice were feeling more cold. So we had a few behavioral tests to really characterize this increased cold behavior. And it looks like they're feeling more cold, so it made them stimulate their brown adipose tissue thermogenesis, which we think is why they're resistant to diet-induced obesity, because they just have increased thermogenesis to start with. So CGRP became somewhat a target for us. We also looked at monoclonal antibodies for CGRP. So CGRP has been the focus of migraine research. It's involving pain. And there's been a lot of effort by the pharmaceutical industry to generate monoclonal antibodies for CGRP in the treatment of migraine. And they've been very efficient. They're FDA approved. So we took advantage of that, and we looked at one of these particular monoclonal antibodies and their abilities to change glycemia in metabolic disease. So one of the key phenotypes that we found in the TRPV1 knockout mice is that not only they had increased energy expenditure, but they also had increased glucose-stimulated insulin secretion, and they had increased beta cell mass. So CGRP interaction with the beta cells was of interest to us. And what we found is that if we gave diabetic mice, we used monogenic models of diabetes to carry on these experiments. When we treated the DBDB mice with monoclonal antibodies, it led to beneficial effect on weight, on glycemia, and we found that the CGRP peptides were interacting with the beta cells, and in particular were counteracting glucose-induced insulin secretion. So that became really interesting to us, and we continued to study that. We also found that CGRP was interacting with fat metabolism. CGRP was suppressing lipolysis, but if we gave the mice a CGRP monoclonal antibody, the animals had increased lipolysis and increased fat fuel consumption in their adipocytes, which led them to have a lower body weight. So CGRP seems to be playing a role in metabolism. Those monoclonal antibodies are already FDA approved, so there perhaps are something to think about in terms of pharmaceutical approach to treat diabetes, perhaps combined with other treatments such as metformin or something like that. There remains to be a lot to investigate because the monoclonal antibodies against CGRP, even though they were very efficient at treating diabetes in diabetic mouse models, they didn't do a good job in mice that were fed a high-fat diet. So it looks like beta cell proliferation in the high-fat diet model is perhaps very high, and those antibodies were not very good at normalizing glycemia in the context of beta cell proliferation. So there's still quite a bit of research to do to understand how CGRP is working to regulate insulin release from the beta cells.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The CGRP medications, have there been any studies in humans that you're aware of looking at changes in energy balance? Or I don't know if you're aware of any kind of clinical trials that might be ongoing targeting that system for human physiology?
I'm not aware of a particular clinical trial. There's been a few patents on CGRP and metabolism. One of them was ours. So it's highly possible that this is being investigated by others.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a great potential future direction there. Finally, as we're wrapping up the segment, just curious for young scientists who might be inspired by your work and may wish to pursue a similar path in diabetes research, if you have any advice that you might offer them, maybe in securing support or possible recognition for their ideas, but this actually could be related to your thoughts on the importance of supporting women in science and the role of organizations like the American Diabetes Association have in career development.
It's such an important topic. I think even nowadays, we're still seeing a lot of women fall off academia and leave academia for diverse reasons. Improving retention of women in academia is I think, very important. And there's a lot to do to help women or motivate women to stay in academia still nowadays. Programs like the Pathway programs are definitely great to support women in their career. I think without the Pathway program, I probably wouldn't be in academia anymore. It's been a great program because it supports individual for quite a few years. So for example, if you get the Initiator Award, you get it at the end of your postdoc. It's a bit like NIH K99 award, and it allows you to build on your research while you transition to independence. And that's a very critical time for a lot of women to get an incentive to stay in academia, because this funding allows women to not only develop their research and their careers, but also if the need is there to start a family, having funding opportunity like that really helps to maintain productivity and maintain a lab while caring for children or others. But I think there's a lot to be done to support young women in academia. What I would love to see is some specific fellowships for women who are dealing with childcare to make them more competitive and ease the stress of having a child and trying to at the same time take care of a lab or continue their work as a grad student or a postdoctoral fellow. And that's very much needed. I think it's been done in quite a few countries, and in those countries, the retention of women is higher than in the US. So we do need programs like that to start appearing in the US to help women stay in academia. And in general, we're seeing that young people tend to be drawn out of academia because industry is very competitive and there are many good reasons to go to industry, whether it's salary or others. But I think the freedom that we get in academia to conduct our research is very unique, and we need more incentives to prevent people at a key time of their life to just leave academia. Because once you leave academia, it's very hard to come back, if not impossible.
That's perfect. Those are really important thoughts and considerations for the advancement of women in the field. And I may point our listeners toward the Women's Interprofessional Network of the American Diabetes Association, or WIN-ADA. This is a member network established by the ADA for female clinicians, scientists, educators, and other health professionals in the field of diabetes. Please visit diabetes.org/membership/WIN-ADA for more information. Thank you, Dr. Riera, for joining us today, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in to this edition of Sweet Talk. Be sure to check out Dr. Riera's article titled Wiring the Brain for Wellness, Sensory Integration in Feeding and Thermogenesis, which can be found in the March 2024 edition of the journal. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this special edition of the Diabetes Bio podcast, which we focused on our Sweet Talk segment. We hope you are enjoying the discussion of the work that the Diabetes Journal is publishing each month. The articles we discuss each month are freely accessible at diabetesjournals.org/diabetes, and this is also listed in the episode notes for your reference. As with any podcast, it really helps us if you like, rate, follow, or subscribe to the podcast. And if you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear that as well. We look forward to presenting to you next month.